In the years following the Battle of Hogwarts, as the world worked tirelessly to rebuild, there was a common refrain heard among the survivors. We will never forget the heroes who fought. Statues were erected in memory of the brave, Harry, Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley. Names like Neville Longbottom, Ginny Weasley, and Luna Lovegood were immortalized in the public eye, their acts of courage woven into the history of the wizarding world. But somewhere between the sweeping triumphs and the crowning victories, there were others, men and women whose sacrifices went largely unremembered. Colin Creevey was one of them. It is true that Colin had never been a key player in the grand saga of Harry Potter's fight against Voldemort. He was young, eager, and often overshadowed by his more famous friends. But it was his courage, his sheer determination to fight for a world that had been ravaged by dark magic, that defined him in ways that were often overlooked. One part narrative, the unseen valor of Colin Creevey. The rain fell in heavy sheets over the hallowed grounds of Hogwarts, the wet earth swallowing the sound of footsteps as Colin Creevey walked alone toward the ancient castle. In his hand, he clutched his camera, a piece of equipment that had often served as a window through which he had watched the great battle unfold. But today, the camera felt like a burden. One more thing he had to carry that no longer seemed to matter. The war had ended, Voldemort defeated, and yet the world seemed no closer to peace than before. The Ministry was rebuilding, trying to create a semblance of order from the chaos. But the survivors who had fought in the battle were not yet whole. The weight of the lives lost, the friendships broken, the sacrifices made. It was all too much for Colin to bear. He had fought bravely, but his role had been smaller than those of his more prominent friends. He had never wielded a sword like Neville Longbottom or cast spells like Hermione Granger. He had never been the face of the resistance, the one the world had rallied behind. He had simply been there, and that, in his mind, was enough, or at least it should have been. As he walked up the stairs to the room of requirement, where he knew others were gathering to discuss the aftermath, Colin's mind drifted to the faces of those he had lost, the ones who had given their lives, their futures, for a cause that had been larger than themselves, the ones who had stepped into the fray knowing they might never return. One face in particular stood out, Seamus Finnegan, a fiery Gryffindor who had fought with a fury that matched his temper. Seamus had been there with Colin from the very beginning, standing by his side in the DA as the first sparks of resistance had begun. They had fought together in the Death Eater ambushes, ducked behind walls as curses flew through the air, and stood shoulder to shoulder when the battle had seemed hopeless. Seamus had always believed in Colin. Even when Colin had felt like a small, insignificant figure amidst the grander scheme of things, Seamus had treated him as an equal. Always, encouraging him, always there when needed, but Seamus had not come out of the battle unscathed. The last time Colin had seen him, Seamus had been struck by a curse that shattered his side. The wound had been grave, but Seamus had refused to let it stop him, clutching his wand with a defiant look on his face. Colin had helped drag him out of the line of fire, but the damage was done. Colin had thought Seamus would survive. He had believed in his friend's strength, in the willpower that had gotten him through countless battles. But in the end, it had been a stray curse, the kind that claimed even the bravest, that took him down. Colin didn't know how to mourn him. There had been so much bloodshed, so many faces, so many names that had been lost. It felt as though Seamus had simply vanished, his life reduced to a handful of memories, a quiet farewell. And yet, as Colin approached the gathered survivors in the room of requirement, he felt the weight of his own silent grief. He hadn't been the hero. He hadn't led the charge or struck down the Dark Lord's forces. He had simply been another young man trying to hold on in a world that had been ripped apart by hatred and fear. Inside the room, the usual faces were gathered. Harry, Hermione, Ron, Neville, and a few others who had fought alongside them. There were quiet conversations happening, but there was no grand celebration, no speeches, no medals. The survivors were simply tired, their bodies and minds weary from the brutality of war. As Colin stepped inside, Harry turned to him with a faint, understanding smile. It was the same smile that had always made Colin feel like he belonged, even when he had never quite felt like he did. "You all right, Colin?" Harry asked, his voice soft with a tenderness that was rare for someone who had carried the weight of an entire world on his shoulders.